Shabbat Shalom, family and friends. We are in the 16th Torah portion, which is titled Beshalach, which means when he let go. It takes place in the book of Exodus, chapter 13, verse 17, through chapter 17, verse 16. It also includes the reading of the prophets in Judges, chapter 4, verses 4, through chapter 5, verse 31. It also includes the reading of the Psalms, chapters 51 through 53, and in the renewed covenant, the book of John, chapter 6, verse 15 through 71. So this Torah portion takes place after God leads his people out of bondage in Egypt on their way to the promised land. Now, what's interesting is that God doesn't lead them directly to the promised land. He could have, and they would have been there in 11 days or so. But instead, they went a roundabout way. Verse 17 of chapter 13, it notes why God doesn't lead them directly to the promised land. So remember, in Canaan, there are people living there with walled cities like Jericho. And God says in verse 17 that if the people are faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So instead, they are led to the wilderness. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds and questioned how they can let the Israelite slaves get away. So they gather an army to go after the children of Israel. So instead of Israel going into a fight or going into a battle, the battle is now brought to them. The children of Israel panic. And just imagine how scary it would be to be in a desert with all of your family and your friends, and really with no formal weapons. And then you see a large military coming after you at full speed. And not just any military, one of the most powerful militaries at that time. So the children of Israel are panicking, asking, why were they brought to the wilderness to die? And weren't there enough graves in Egypt? And they even tell Moses, didn't we tell you while we were in Egypt to leave us alone that we might serve the Egyptians? But if you think about it, wasn't this also the same group of individuals that just days before witness the plagues that the Lord put on Egypt for them to be let go? So they still don't trust in the power of their Lord. On the flip side, the Egyptians just witnessed the power of Israel's God multiple times through the plagues. And now they're going to test Israel's God one more time. It's very easy to judge. But how many times when I come across adversity do I kind of panic and forget about all those times that the Lord delivered me out of trouble? Now, Moses responds to the panicking of Israel, noting for them to not be afraid. He tells them to stand still and watch the Lord rescue them. And that's a key. To me, that's a key word, is to watch. Watch the Lord rescue them. Now, the angel of God, who was leading the people of Israel, moved to the rear of the camp, and a cloud settled between the Egyptians and the Israelites. So let's just pause here for a little bit. I just want to point out that while the Israelites are panicking, They are being guided by a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire during the night. So God is already providing provision for them while they're in the wilderness. Yet, they don't think God is going to save them from the Egyptians. And let's just think about this provision God is providing them. Remember, they are in the wilderness, they are in a desert. And God is protecting them from the harsh sun in the form of a cloud. So that cloud is providing shelter and it's protecting them from the sun. And it's also cooling them, you could say, because the sun provides that warmth. And so with that shade, it's cooler. And at nighttime, just remember that in the desert, it's very cold. And God is coming to them in the form of a pillar of fire. So at nighttime, God is protecting them from that harsh cold with the warmth from the fire. And by the way, that fire is also providing light in the middle of their darkness. Yet, they believe that God is going to let them die in the wilderness. I wonder if a lot of this panic comes from what they set their eyes on. If they focus on seeing this vast military coming at them at full speed, I can see how that would be scary. But if they pay attention to that pillar of cloud, the one that's been leading them and protecting them from the elements, they would notice that it's moving towards the rear of the camp. And that very same pillar, it eventually serves as a barrier between the Egyptians and the Israelite camps. So God told Moses to raise his staff and raise his hand over the sea. The Red Sea is divided so that Israel can walk through the middle of the sea on dry ground. Now, you can say that it could be desperation, but you could also argue it took faith for the Israelites to cross the Red Sea. The Bible notes that there were walls of water on both sides. So they were acting on faith that those walls were going to be held up until they reach the other side. How about the Egyptians? They also attempted to cross the Red Sea. Why would they think that this miracle would continue for them? I get it that some soldiers were just following orders. But didn't some of the leaders question Pharaoh's judgment to go after them through the Red Sea? Maybe they were so focused on doing evil, they didn't even second guess what was going on around them. They were caught up in the moment with what they wanted to accomplish. The Bible notes that the Lord threw the Egyptian military into confusion. The chariots became difficult to drive, and the Egyptians recognized that the Lord was fighting against them for Israel. As the sun began to rise, Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the waters returned and covered the chariots and charioteers. None of the Egyptians survived. Israel witnessed how the Lord fought their battle for them. The Bible notes that the Israelites saw Egyptian bodies washing up on the seashore. They were filled with awe and they put their faith in the Lord. Remember, though, that before the Lord destroyed Egypt's military, Israel also needed to take a step of faith and cross that Red Sea. even though it seemed dangerous with walls of water on both sides. God fought for them, but they needed to do their part. And what they did is that they continued following the path the Lord wanted for them. And that path that they were on destroyed the enemy pursuing them. The Egyptian army wouldn't have attempted to cross the Red Sea if it wasn't for the fact that they were pursuing Israel. Later on in this Torah portion, Israel continues to complain about the water, about not getting meat, but God continues to provide provision for them. Now, I did want to jump to the reading of the New Testament, where there's a short story in John, the book of John, chapter 6, verses 16 through 21. And in this story, the disciples went down to the shore to wait for him. But as darkness fell and Jesus still hadn't come back, they got into the boat and headed across the lake toward Capernaum. Soon a gale swept down upon them, and the sea grew very rough. And they had rowed around 3 or 4 miles when suddenly they saw Jesus walking on the water toward the boat, and they were terrified. But he called out to them, "Don't be afraid, I am here." And then they were eager to let him in the boat, and immediately they arrived at their destination. Now, in that story, the disciples were afraid because they didn't expect Jesus to come the way he did. I mean, he was walking on top of the water. On top of that, it's in the middle of the night. There's a strong wind, and I could understand at least why they were afraid, because it wasn't what they were expecting. However, once they recognized that it was Jesus, they were eager to let him in the boat. And scripture notes that the boat immediately arrived at their destination. In the Torah portion, who would have thought that God would split the Red Sea for Israel's salvation and destruction of their enemy? But God is God and has his own ways. What's important is that we welcome the Lord in our journey and follow that path that he set before us. As we enter into this new week, let's keep our eyes on the Lord and the path he set before us. Shabbat Shalom.